Here is a problem that you should be aware of with high lumber prices and people trying to substitute some things for other things that might not work. And one of those things will be mixing conventional standard lumber and engineered lumber for your floor framing. For example, if I'm going to use 2x12 Douglas fir construction lumber for the joist and engineered TJI blocks, then you're probably not going to have a problem if everything is 11.5 inches. However, that is not going to be the case if the joists shrink. And trust me, I've seen 2x12 joists shrink 3/8 of an inch. And with the scale model here, I dropped it 1/4 of an inch. And along with the lumber shrinking, you're going to put all of the pressure from all of the weight above on these blocks, and they might not be able to support the load above. Along with the fact you're going to end up with squeaking floors, because as the lumber shrinks, it will either need to pull up away from the top of the framing plates or pull down away from the plywood, providing you with a gap like this. And for most of you familiar with lumber shrinkage, this is going to create a squeaking floor because there will be plenty of room for the plywood or the sheathing to move up and down and rub up against the nails. And this is bad enough when we're using construction standard lumber. We don't need to make it worse by mixing the two. And now for those of you thinking to reverse the situation and use truss joists for the floor joist and conventional lumber for the blocks, you're going to end up with the opposite effect as the blocks shrink and the joists don't. And again, something like this is going to put all of the pressure on the truss joists. And if you don't have any webbing in here, you're going to end up with more problems as the truss joists start to deform, and in some cases they could fail. And as the lumber shrinks, it can either shrink and leave a gap on the bottom or shrink and leave a gap on the top. Or in some cases, it can shrink a little bit on the bottom and a little bit on the top. And even though a floor like this won't be squeaking because you're not going to have any separation here, you're still going to be dealing with all of the weight on top of the joist instead of the rim. And I know that you're thinking, hey, wait a minute, instead of using blocks, I will use a full-length piece of construction standard lumber. Well, that might provide you with a little more support, but you're still going to have a gap that could create additional stress on the individual joists that would be carrying all of the weight. So let's go ahead and follow instructions from your engineer or the manufacturer of the products. And now might be a good time to point out for those of you milling your own lumber that you can end up with even bigger problems depending upon whether or not you've allowed the lumber to dry out enough to where shrinking lumber will not be a big problem. So the moral to this story will be to avoid using lumber that can shrink a little more than lumber that isn't going to shrink very much. In this video, I will provide you with a simple formula that is used by a variety of different carpenters. However, I have to say I've never used this one myself to calculate the length of a floor joist. And it's quite simple. And in this video, I went ahead and did my own test. And even though it might not provide you with a smaller lumber size, it will definitely provide you with something that will work. And to do it, you're simply taking half of the span and then adding the number 2 to it to get the height of the joist. So it's quite simple. Let me go ahead and walk you through this one here where we have a 10-foot span. And you will also need to round your number off to the nearest foot. I will provide you with an example of that towards the end of the video. So let's go ahead and divide 10 by 2. We get 5. Then we're going to add 2 to get the height of the joist. 5 plus 2 is 7 for a 2 by 8 joist. Now let's go ahead and check it with the span chart from the 2021 Residential Building Code book, where the lumber spans here for 16-inch on-center lumber. For 2 by 8 Douglas fir will be 12 foot 9 inches. And for southern pine, number 2, it will be 11 foot 10 inches. And for 2 by 6 Douglas fir, number 2 grade, these are all number 2 graded lumbers, which is more of a construction standard lumber in most areas. And I would also like to point out that these lumber spans do change. You could probably use 10-foot 2x6 if it was number 1 or select. However, you would need to check with the span charts to verify those lengths. And for Southern Pine number 2, 2x6, 9-foot 4 inches is the maximum span, suggesting that this method right here actually works. However, to prove that, let's go ahead and take a look at a few more span lengths. However, I'm not going to walk you through the entire process. I'm just going to pop up a few numbers. You can take a look at them, pause the video at any time to figure out if this method actually works. Now, in this example here, we can actually use 2x6. But we're not going to get in trouble if we use a 2x8. So this is kind of where I was going with this, suggesting that it might not provide you with the best money-saving advice, however, will provide you with a strong floor. Next up, let's go ahead and take a look at an 8-foot span. And in this example here, I would like to point out that we're looking at the number 6. We're not using the actual size of the lumber, like 5.5 on a 2x6. We're using the nominal size, or the number that you're going to use when purchasing the lumber, like a 2x6 or a 2x8. We're going to be using the number 6 for 2x6, 8 for 2x8, and so on. Next up, let's go ahead and take a look at an 11-foot span, where we end up with 7.5, providing us with a 2x8 joist, and we can see where this works out just fine with our lumber chart spans. Next up, let's take a look at a 12-foot span where we won't have a problem using Douglas fir, but we might have a problem using Southern pine. And of course, this example provides us with our first failure using this method, even though it isn't off by much. And in our last example, let's take a 12-foot 9-inch board. We're also going to be using this number because it represents the longest length we can use for number 2 Douglas fir, along with an example for a number that will need to be rounded to the nearest whole number, which in this case will be 13, and see what we end up with. And as you can see here, we have an 8.5 suggesting that we need to use 2x10 instead of 2x8, even though the lumber chart suggests otherwise. So in my opinion, I think this general rule of thumb is close enough. It might not be used by a structural engineer. However, I think in most of the examples we saw that it got close enough or provided us with a larger lumber size that was going to create a stronger floor. And thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, let us know by hitting the thumbs up button or letting us know in the comment area.